comes to the superior aspect of the patient lying down here. So superior aspect of the screen and superior aspect of the patient are in sync. Similarly, the inferior aspect, you can see my probe is seen inferiorly, and this is the lower portion. Here is the cervix, this is my probe in the vagina. So this is the inferior portion of the patient. So the inferior part of the patient is seen in the inferior part of the screen. So it becomes very clear orienting. Anything above on the upper portion of the screen is the upper portion of the patient. Anything on the lower part of the screen is lower portion of the patient. So orientation becomes very simple. On transverse section, of course, so long section variable, but transverse section is internationally fixed. Anything on the right of the patient should be seen on the right of the uterus or right of the screen, this half of the screen. Anything on the left should be seen on the left half of the screen. Now you will see over here for trans-abdominal scan, long section and transverse section is fixed. For trans-vaginal scan, long section is the variable part, but transverse section is always fixed. And I want to tell you why this orientation is not the generally acceptable orientation. The reason is that if you look over here at the uterus, structures that are seen inferior to the uterus are seen on the upper part of the screen. And structures that, this is the lower portion where the transvaginal probe is the inferior aspect of the patient. And structures that are seen superior to the uterus are seen in the inferior part of the screen. It's actually the reverse of what we are seeing over here. And that's why orientation, one may get used to it, but it is much simpler to have the orientation in this position. So if one hasn't gotten used to any particular style, it is recommended that you have your footprint down. Another advantage is this is the recommended way of doing the ultrasound scan. The other advantage is that when you have a trans-abdominal and a trans-vaginal scan, one has the footprint on top, one has the footprint down, it becomes very easy. Moment I see my images, I say, oh, these are the trans-vaginal images, these are the trans-abdominal images, because the footprint for one is always on top, footprint for the other is always below. But if I have this orientation, it can cause confusion because in both of them, the footprint is above. So differentiation between TS and TVS images becomes very simple if for TVS, the footprint is down. So now we move on to the next part, and that is having seen the long section and transverse section of the uterus, the next thing is to look at the coronal section of the uterus. On 2D grayscale imaging, we do not typically get good coronal images of the uterus, and the best way to get it in almost all cases, or in most cases, is either through a TS or TVS. You can get it in almost all cases, is a 3D rendered image of the uterus, which shows you a beautiful coronal image of the uterine cavity and a clear visualization of the endomyometrial junction. And you can also see the outer surface of the myometrium, that is the serosal surface. Now, this may not be required in all patients, but it's very useful in classifying uterine anomalies, in seeing how a submucous fibroid is distorting the endometrial cavity, in looking at the endomyometrial junction sometimes, and seeing a displaced IUCD, etc. So this is a short video clip of a transvaginal scan. One thing very important is, of course, you have to adjust gain, depth, focus, and zoom into the area of interest, which is very, very important. But one important point is when you place the probe. So what we do is we look at the introitus and just place our probe there. And then you do not have to look at the introitus anymore because the patient will be uncomfortable. So once you have placed your probe at the introitus like this, next your eyes should be on the screen of your ultrasound machine. And you can see on your screen, this is the anorectal canal over here. That is the vaginal lumen. This is the urethra, and that is the bladder. So you can follow the vagina upwards, and more importantly, your probe should always be directed a little posteriorly because the vagina's natural direction is a little posterior, and because the urethra, which lies anterior, is more sensitive, and that can cause discomfort to the patient. So once I play I place my probe on the introitus, I'm going to look at the screen and gradually, very slowly, introduced my probe, but at the same time, I'm going to look at the vaginal walls, the urethra, and whatever little bit of the bladder. The bladder is better seen at the end of your scan when it partially fills up, and that's when you can visualize the bladder better. So remember, while withdrawing, bladder visualization is important. So now you see I'm introducing this probe and you can see the vaginal walls. This is the vaginal lumen, and as we move up, you can see over here, this is the bladder wall, this is the empty bladder, that is the uterus, and we are slowly approaching the cervix. Remember, cervix is a structure that can be very well visualized in most cases. There is some limitation because of its proximity, but if you take care before you just hit straight into the uterine fundus, that most people, uterine body, most of us have a tendency to quickly jump to the uterine body for two reasons. One is cervix is not well visualized. Secondly, cervix doesn't have pathology most often. You just have a few Nabothian follicles at most. And most often, unless there's some intermenstrual bleeding and you want to look at a polyp, cervix is not a structure that we routinely see, which is very wrong, because there are cervical malignancies, cervical polyps that have been missed in multiple patients. So you see over here, you can see beautifully the internal os, the external os. You can actually see the posterior wall of the vagina. And now you see I'm applying pressure. As I apply pressure, you will see that the utrovesical fold over the bladder in the UV fold is actually sliding along the uterus. This tells me that the bladder is not adherent to the uterus, which may be something we see in patients with previous cesarean sections, patients with bladder endometriosis, etc. So here you see this utrovesical fold is sliding beautifully. So now I know that the UV fold, the bladder is not adherent. Now I'm going to look posteriorly. So look at this posterior the pouch of Douglas and the bowel posterior to the uterus and the vagina, and you see how beautifully it's sliding along the posterior wall of the uterus. So now I know that the bowels are not adherent to the posterior wall, and so I'm happy. Now I want to look at the uterus. So now I'm going to zoom into, you can see when you're looking at the uterus, you zoom in, you see from long section exactly what we did on transabdominal scan. On long section, we scan the uterus from one end to the other end on long section. Then we do a 90-degree rotation in clockwise direction. Again, from transverse section, we go up and down. So here you see, this is a long section. Having seen the uterus and the cervix, you see, we see the cervix too. And then we do a 90-degree rotation right from the external os, internal os, right up to the uterine fundus. Again, make sure that there is a single cavity and both the cornua are disappearing at the same time. So I know that there is no uterine anomaly. Once I've done with the uterus, I need to look at the ovaries. So after I've seen the uterus and the endometrium carefully, I look at the ovaries. Here is one side. Now you can see I'm rotating my probe to the opposite direction. Sometimes it is very easy to see the ovary, because in a premenopausal lady, because of the presence of follicles, because they're not tiny, and it's lying just beside the uterus. Sometimes it can be more challenging, and in these cases, what we do is we come back to the transverse section of the uterus, follow the uterovarian ligament, which will lead us to the ovary. So this is how we visualize, and these are the external iliac vessels. So this is the basic principles. Of course, if I need to get into details of techniques, tips and tricks, we would have to cover the entire gynecological ultrasound, which will take hours and hours. So I'm just telling you the basic principles. Now, why do we do a transabdominal scan? You see the transvaginal scan, the probe has high frequency. We are very close to the structures. There's very good resolution. But then why do we need to do a transabdominal scan? Because the transabdominal scan provides us a great overview, and small structures can be very well located. And this is so because the full bladder's aim is to push the bowels away. The bowels are non-pelvic structures. They get moved up, and all that you see is ironed out or slightly ironed out pelvis, all structures seen through the bladder, which acts as a window. So you can see small truss structures like ectopics, etc. Another great advantage, when we have a large pelvic mass, we know it leaves the true pelvis and moves upwards into the upper abdomen. So large pelvic masses, you will have to do a transabdominal scan for complete evaluation. In addition, there may be some structures itself seen above the uterine fundus, like a subserous pedunculated fibroid, an ovary sitting above the uterus, which you may not be able to see on transvaginal scan. In dermoids, for example, you can see the entire dermoid on transabdominal scan. In the same patient on transvaginal scan, all that we saw was the lower end of the dermoid, because dermoids are known to cause acoustic shadowing. And with a transvaginal probe, we couldn't see anything beyond this. So it is said of a dermoid, if you feel a mass on your physical examination, bimanual examination, transabdominal examination, but on ultrasound, you don't find a mass, think in terms of a dermoid, because it looks like bowel, as you can see over here. The endometrium of a mid-positioned uterus is better seen on transabdominal than on transvaginal scan, and we have a whole slide to discuss this. Even uterine anomalies are better seen often on a transabdominal than a transvaginal scan, not only in a mid-position uterus, but even otherwise because of the varying plane. So you have the cervix in one plane, you have the uterine body in another plane, and even the uterine body, one horn may be in one direction, the other horn may be in another direction. So how do you get a nice coronal rendered image of both the uterine horns and the cervix? This full bladder flattens it out a little bit more, and that helps with better visualization. So here was a patient with the uterine anomaly. This is the best transabdominal scan I could get, and this is the best transvaginal scan. And in my view, the transabdominal scan was slightly better than the transvaginal scan. So if the transabdominal scan is very good, why do we do a transvaginal scan? The transabdominal scan has a low frequency, high penetration, so it provides a great overview. Whereas a transvaginal scan has high frequency, lower penetration, but better resolution. So when I locate a structure, when I want to study it in detail, that's when a transvaginal scan is very helpful, because it provides a close-up view of structures. Small lesions which may not be seen on trans. So if I see small, here you can see, for example, this was the ovary. This, of course, bladder is overfull. The ovary is lying behind the uterus. Sort of looks okay to me, normal in size. But on transvaginal scan, I could see tiny endometriotic cysts. So the resolution is very good. You could see tiny endometriotic cysts within the ovary. This transvaginal scan gives us, because of good resolution, gives us better texture determination and characterization of pathology. So on transabdominal scan, we are seeing a cyst with septae, but on transvaginal scan, and once you zoom in, you can actually see the septae, you can see the irregular papillary and solid projections and solid tissue in these cases. Again, because of proximity of the structures, Doppler flow would be better assessed on a transvaginal than a transabdominal probe most often. Again, if the mass is much higher up, it will be better seen on transabdominal. But generally, the closer the probe is to the structure, the better is the Doppler evaluation. But most importantly, the transvaginal probe offers a superb way, and this is something fantastic about a transvaginal scan, a superb way of performing an internal physical examination where you can touch the structures along with the ability to simultaneously see those structures. And that is why we say a transvaginal scan is a dynamic and interactive. You can touch an organ and ask her, is it hurting you? You can touch an organ and see whether it's moving. Are there adhesions over here? So this dynamic and interactive nature of a transvaginal examination is something that CT and MRI also cannot provide. And that is a great advantage of transvaginal scan. So let's see what are the structures we see on a transvaginal scan. One is the endometrium. Now, the endometrium may show you the typical three-layer, the three-layer pattern, or the three-line pattern that is very classical of a proliferative endometrium in a woman of reproductive age group. After ovulation, the endometrium starts getting hyperechoic from the periphery towards the inside, and then this is the secretory endometrium. And in most secretory endometrium, the endometrium is hyperechoic, but you can typically still see the midline. The midline is white when the beam in the area which is perpendicular to my ultrasound beam, and it is darker when in the part that is parallel to my ultrasound beam, but you can still see the midline. Then in the menstrual phase, you will see that the endometrium looks complex. There are hypoechoic areas because of blood. There are hyperechoic areas because of tiny clots. And the whole endometrium becomes over a period of, gradually over as towards the end of periods, it gets thinner and thinner to less than 5 millimeters in most patients. And then you have an endometrium which doesn't fit any of these three. And this is a hyperechoic endometrium or an echogenic endometrium. So we report it as hyperechoic or echogenic, but this is very often seen in a patient with high estrogen levels, like a hypoplastic endometrium. It can be seen if you have a thick menstruating endometrium also. You may not see it like this. You may just see a hyperechoic. So a hyperechoic endometrium is called echogenic. So when we are reporting, either we say proliferative endometrium, secretory, menstruating, or echogenic endometrium, depending on what is our subjective evaluation of that endometrium. Next is, how do we measure the endometrium? So one of the measurements that is a must in every report is the thickness of the endometrium, particularly so in a postmenopausal lady. Of course, you have to measure it in every single patient. How do we measure this endometrium? We measure it wherever it is maximally thick in the mid-sagittal plane. And how do I know I'm in the mid-sagittal plane? You see on the cervix, the cervical canal is becoming continuous into as an endometrium. Can you see from the cervical canal to the endometrial cavity? It's continuous. So I know I'm in the mid-sagittal plane, and the upper end of the endometrium is rounded off. So now I know I'm in the mid-sagittal plane. In this mid-sagittal plane, I will take the thickest possible measurement and give that value in millimeters. Remember, we must see that the measurement is perpendicular to our midline, and it should exclude the junctional zone, the hypoechoic junctional zone, which is the innermost layer of the myometrium. So we have to exclude that. If there is intracavitary fluid, we must measure wherever the endometrium is maximally thick, or we can add the anterior and the posterior and report it as a 2-layer thickness. Endometrial pathology, you will see, is most striking and stands out best when you have a 3-layer endometrium, because any pathology will obviously stand out very easily. And therefore, if one is thinking of searching for polyps, if there is a patient who's infertile and she wants to come in the first time for a scan, you want to make sure there are no polyps, call her in the late proliferative phase. If the patient has intermenstrual bleeding, better to call her in the late proliferative or the proliferative phase, because the endometrium is thick and 3-lined, and any pathology will stand out beautifully. Polyps may be more difficult to pick up, or are more difficult to pick up in a secretory endometrium, because the whole endometrium becomes echogenic. A mid-position uterus is very difficult to study and even to measure the endometrium sometimes. And remember, if something, endometrium or anything, is not visualized, please mention so in the report. Say that the endometrium was not measurable, or it was suboptimally assessed, or it could not be assessed. Say I have a large cervical fibroid. Say I have a mid-position uterus. Remember, what is very, very important, more than actually 100% giving a diagnosis, is credibility of your report. So if you feel that the patient has a pathology, say you feel on your ultrasound patient has a polyp, she should have a polyp. If I say this is a normal local endometrium, I've scanned from left to right, up and down, I found no pathology, then it should be normal. But in a patient like this, I would always report I have not assessed the endometrium properly, unless I got a very good assessment on transabdominal scan. And even then, I would make a note that on transabdominal scan, the endometrium was better seen. On transvaginal scan, visualization was suboptimal. So it will tell the practicing clinician and the patient that, yes, I feel on transabdominal scan, it's fine, but we know transvaginal scan is a better way of evaluating the endometrium. And in that scan, Mala was not able to look at the endometrium properly. So credibility of your report is extremely important. From endometrium, we move on to the myometrium. We look at the echogenicity of the myometrium, thickness of the uterine walls, the contour of the uterus, presence of any mass, cyst, etc. Here you can see a homogeneous myometrium with the anterior and posterior walls being equally thick. Here you can see a very coarse looking thickened posterior wall with this fine shadowing fan-shaped shadowing because of adenomyosis. In contrast, you see the anterior wall is pretty thin. Here you see a uterus where the contour is distorted because of the presence of multiple fibroids. And here you can see there are multiple cysts in the uterus because of adenomyosis. Now, another very important thing to see is the coronal view of the uterus to see the shape of the uterine cavity and the endomyometrial junction. So here you see, here you can, I think I missed a slide. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, this is the slide. So sorry about this. So another thing, after we've seen the endometrium and the myometrium, is the endomyometrial junction. So what we see, this is the endometrium, 3-layer endometrium, but look at the endomyometrial junction. It is not clear at all as compared to what we saw where we were measuring the endometrium. So you see over here, there's endometrial tissue actually growing into this junctional zone. The junctional zone is thicker. The margins of the endometrium are irregular. So what do we look in the junctional zone? We look for endometrial buds. We look for endometrial islands. We look for cystic spaces, irregular margins, thickened junction zone, etc., all which are fibers, which are features of adenomyosis. So here, can you see the endometrium actually growing into the surrounding junctional zone? There are hyperechoic foci, tiny cystic spaces. Can you see that cystic space over here? So you see tiny cystic spaces, hyperechoic foci, irregular margins, and all these are features of adenomyosis. So looking at the junctional zone should be a routine for all gynecological scans. Then we look at the endomyometrial junction and the shape of the uterine cavity with 3D to take a coronal rendered view. Here you see a normal, nice triangular uterine cavity, a very clear uterine contour, absolutely normal uterus. Here we see the cavity split into two in a case of a uterine anomaly. Here we see a fibroid, which is actually two fibroids. One of them is actually pushing, distorting, and flattening out the upper endometrium. The other fibroid is close to the endometrial cavity, but it's not distorting. So this is better seen on 3D. And here you can see the endomyometrial junction is completely disrupted because of adenomyosis. And this is the same patient that we saw in the previous video clip. So you can see the endomyometrial junction disruption even on 2D, but you could reconfirm on 3D if you like. And sometimes 2D is better, sometimes 3D, and together you get the best picture. After the uterus, endomyometrial junction, endometrium, cervix, bowel sliding, and utrovesic bladder sliding on the uterus, we move on to the adnexal surface. So we look at the ovaries, and normally in reproductive women of the reproductive age group, you do see a few follicles. And if you have a patient, you can just measure the developing follicle, particularly if she's coming for infertility. Or you can, if you think that there are just multiple small follicles you don't want to measure, that's also fine. Remember, avoid the term cyst for physiological corpus luteum and follicular cysts, because for follicles, because it gives a very wrong message to the patient, causes a lot of anxiety because she feels now she has a neoplastic mass. So please avoid the term cyst. At times when the largest measurement of the follicle is more than 2.5 or more than 3 centimeters, you may call it a cyst. But if you're calling it a cyst, call it a follicular cyst. If you just use the word cyst, it causes a lot of stress. Corpus luteal cyst, follicular cyst, developing follicle, these are better terms. Now, follicle is very easy to see. It's an anechoic unilocular smooth-walled cyst of up to about 2.5 centimeters, seen in the ovary in the proliferative phase. And after rupture, it becomes a corpus luteum. The interesting part of a corpus luteum is it can look very, very variable, but certain features that are very typical is thick walls. If there is a cavity, sometimes it's completely solid. If there's a cavity, there are some internal echoes because of hemorrhage, and it has very high peripheral vascularity. Now, what about polycystic ovaries? The Rotterdam criteria has been changing. First of all, I want to say polycystic ovarian syndrome is not the same as polycystic ovaries. Polycystic ovaries is just one of the features for polycystic ovarian syndrome, and I don't have time to get into it. I just want to tell you, presently the consensus is the antral follicle count to call an ovary a polycystic ovary, there should be 20 or more antral follicles. Next, I want to tell you that when you are looking at the ovary, remember the ovary, if you cannot find the ovary at times, remember these are the external iliac vessels and they run on both sides along the lateral pelvic wall. So if you cannot find your ovary, find these vessels and look up and down along the vessels, you will be able to find the ovaries very often. And this is particularly so when you're looking at a postmenopausal ovary, when you can't find it. Another reason why I've shown you this external iliac vessels is any patient where you have a neoplastic mass, where you're suspecting a malignancy, maybe endometrial malignancy, maybe ovarian, you can search for lymph nodes along the external iliac vessels. So this is an area where we typically search for lymph nodes. In a patient who's already been treated for malignancy, she comes back for a review. You don't have the ovaries, the uterus, but she still come for a scan. Look at the vaginal wall, look at the pelvic peritoneum, and look along the external iliac vessels for the presence of any lymph nodes. Remember, the ovary can vary in size significantly. In the normal range is quite variable, and it is not the size of the ovary that is important. Like in endometrium in postmenopausal women, it's the thickness that is given some importance at least. When you have a hyperplastic endometrium, you say it's 2.5 centimeters, you say, oh my God, it's really thick. But in the ovary, more than thickness, even in the endometrium, morphology is important, but also measurement. In the ovary, it's primarily the morphology of the ovary that is given importance for diagnosis of pathology. Now, coming to the fallopian tubes normally are difficult to visualize, but they may be seen if there is some fluid seen in the pouch of Douglas, which is the case when there is ovulation. So if you have fluid lying in the pouch of Douglas, some minimal fluid, it is normal, acceptable in the reproductive age group. But if you have fluid lying anterior to the uterus, above the uterus, then that is too much fluid and it is called ascites. So here you see this is a normal fallopian tube. I'm only visualizing it because there is some fluid here in the pelvis. And this you can see is beautifully seen, fimbrial end of the normal fallopian tube overlying the ovary. The fallopian tube can also be seen when it is pathological, like when you have a hydrosalpinx. Here you see this is a pyosalpinx. You can see the turbid fluid in the lumen, the thick walls and increased vascularity. So if the tube is diseased, or if the fimbrial end of the tube is lying in some fluid, you might be able to see the fallopian tubes, but typically you don't. Nowadays, machines are so good that we are able to sort of delineate even a normal looking fallopian tube, but this is still, I think, a little subjective and only with some really high-end machines. Next, we move on to how do we measure a mass. We measure any mass in gynecology, particularly adnexal masses, ovaries, papilla, or even the uterus for that matter, in 3 diameters of the mass in 2 planes at right angles to each other. Now, in the uterus, this is predefined. Like I told you, you see the uterocervical link, the anterior, posterior, and the transverse. There are also 3 orthogonal measurements. But say you're seeing an adnexal mass in an ovary, you have to get this measurement by getting 2 images of the mass in 2 planes perpendicular to each other. One should be the plane where the component appears the largest, and wherever I feel it's largest, I say I want that image, but then I move my probe a little so that the longest measurement lies perpendicular to my beam. So if this is the mass, I will go around and tilt it so that on the screen it looks more horizontal. So I try and get my maximum measurement horizontal to my on the screen. And then I do a 90-degree rotation for the transverse section of the mass. And this is how you get. So you get across the screen once. Here again, you measure the second measurement on the first image perpendicular to your first measurement. So this is the maximum measurement. This second measurement is perpendicular to your first measurement. And this is on the second image, the maximum measurement you get across the screen. And most machines will automatically give you the volume, but if they don't, you can always calculate the volume multiplying these 3 by 0.523. Remember, it is only volume that will help you assess the regression or the growth of cysts and masses, because all masses are not absolute spheres, right? If it was a sphere, a single diameter would be enough, but they are oblong, they are slightly differently shaped. So the only way to actually know whether a mass is growing or regressing is to get the volume of a mass. Next, two slides on Doppler. One is what is the use of Doppler? Well, Doppler is very essential today. It is very important because firstly, it tells me whether there is flow in a structure or there is no flow. Here is two hypoechoic structures. I know this is thick turbid fluid because it has no flow inside. And here I'm sure this is solid because there is flow inside. So presence of flow confirms solid tissue. Absence of flow suggests it is fluid, but you're not 100% sure. That's the difference, because rarely you may have solid tissue with no flow, as in the case of torsion, as in the case of improper Doppler settings, or if your probe is too far away from the structure to be able to pick up Doppler signals. But if I see Doppler flow within a hypoechoic mass, within an echogenic mass, I'm 100% sure that this is solid tissue. So that is the first very important use of Doppler, to confirm solid tissue, because we know in adnexal masses, for example, what happens, solid tissue increases the likelihood of malignancy. Second thing is it tells me whether the flow is minimal or whether the flow is abundant. We know more flow is seen in malignancies, is seen in infections, is seen in trophoblastic tissue, corpus luteal tissue, etc. It tells me whether the flow is central or peripheral. So the location of flow. Central flow is adenomyoma, peripheral circumferential flow tells me this is a fibroid. So in some challenging cases, it helps me distinguishing between a fibroid and a adenomyoma. Next, it tells me whether the flow is high resistance and low resistance. High resistance is more likely to be benign, low resistance more likely to be malignant or infection, but there is a huge overlap. And this was a patient with high resistance flow in case of a torsion of the uterus, of the ovary. And this was a patient with low resistance flow. This was a case of a fallopian tube malignancy. Another advantage of Doppler, it tells me the site of origin. So here you see, I'm seeing a polyp in the cervix, but is this really a cervical polyp? No, because when you use Doppler, this is an old case of mine, you see I'm using color Doppler. So when I use Doppler, I realized that this was actually originating high up in the anterior wall, right at the upper end of the endometrial cavity, but it had prolapsed into the cervical canal. So this told me that this is not a cervical polyp, but an endometrial polyp lying in the cervical canal. What is very, very important in Doppler is Doppler settings should be optimized. Evaluation of any structure on Doppler requires Doppler settings. And if you have not heard me before, I'm sure if you've heard me before, you've heard this 100 times, that there is one thing that I believe everybody should remember from today's talk, and that is Doppler settings. I'll come to that soon. So how do we evaluate Doppler? Today, it is primarily by color score. We do get pulse wave tracings. We do check peak systolic. We do check the RI and PI to see the resistance to flow. But a lot of importance today is given to color score. What is color score? Color score is a subjective, semi-quantitative assessment of the overall flow in a structure. So say I'm looking at an adnexal mass, I look at the walls, the septae, any solid area papillae, and see how do I feel. If I feel there is no flow in the mass, I'll call it color score 1. If there's minimal flow, I'll call it color score 2, where you have to actually search for signals. This is the external iliac vessels. You have to search for color signals. Moderate flow is color score 3, and abundant flow is color score 4. So what are the settings that I was talking about? First, and this scoring is the same thing with the endometrium, with all of these. If you look at the AITA protocol, it tells you the same findings. It's color score 1, 2, 3, and 4. So what are these Doppler settings that are very important? Almost in all gynecological pathology, barring a few like an AV malformation, or you're looking at the uterine flows for infertility research work, other than a few conditions, almost always it is better to use power Doppler or HT flow, because these can pick up low velocity flow and flow in tiny vessels, which will not be picked up with color flow. So that's the first thing. Second thing is the PRF should be brought down to 0.3 to 0.6, because if your PRF is too high, again, you will not pick up low velocity flow and flow in tiny vessels. And the third thing is the Doppler gain should be maximum, but without artifacts. So what I do is I don't turn on my color Doppler, I turn on my power Doppler or HD flow. I make sure my PRF is 0.3 to 0.6. And remember, it's better to fix to 1. Like some persons will just fix it at 0.3, because your eye begins to subjectively assess minimal, moderate, and abundant flow based on your machine's Doppler settings. Even if you get a new machine, it will take time for you to figure out, do I call this minimal flow or moderate or abundant flow? So fix it at 1 PRF. You can alter it from there. So usually I fix mine at 0.6. And if I feel I'm not seeing enough flow, I bring it down to 0.3. But there are many who fix it at 0.3, and that is also perfectly acceptable. Once I fix my PRF, then I get hold of my Doppler gain button and I start increasing my Doppler gain till I begin to see artifacts on the screen. Moment I see artifacts, that is spill of color beyond the vessels, I stop and I turn down my Doppler gain till the artifacts just disappear. That is appropriate Doppler setting. Now I'm going to highlight the importance of Doppler setting with this case. Here was a 34-year-old lady with an 8 centimeter, that was the maximal length of the endometrioma, who was being treated for infertility. She was operated with partial cystectomy with the idea to retain her fertility. Now the histopathology report came as endometriotic cyst and all was well. She came back 3 months later when I was surprised to see that she had a solid mass, a large solid papillary projection projecting into the cystic area with irregular margins, central abundant flow. This is an old case of mine, and that's why instead of power Doppler, I've used color Doppler. Today, I would have used power Doppler or HD flow. And this told me that this could be a malignancy. So I went back and we had images that were available, and we realized that this mass was actually present even earlier, but it was reported as a clot because the PRF was set too high at 1.3. So when you have turbid fluid, sound transmission further decreases. PRF was too high, 1.3, and those times we used to use color Doppler. So this was mistaken for a clot instead of a solid tissue. Here you can see the fluid has become less thick, and that's because she recently had surgery. So the endometriotic fluid is not very thick yet. The PRF is 0.6. And you see this did turn out to be an endometrioid carcinoma grade 2 arising in a background of endometriosis. So I just want to highlight the importance. First of all, not all ground glass cysts are endometriomas. They can be malignant. Secondly, endometriotic cysts may undergo malignant transformation. You may have clear cell carcinomas, you can have endometrioid carcinomas. So whenever you see a hyperechoic area within a mass, within any mass, make sure whether it is, you have to ascertain, is this solid tissue or not? It's very, very important, because solid tissue increases significantly the likelihood of malignancy. And for that, you must evaluate with Doppler, but Doppler settings should be optimized. Now how do we assess flexion and version? Now, this is a question that comes up a lot in live workshops. How do we assess? So this is what we do. This is, you see, this is the angle or the plane of the vagina. This is the angle of the cervical canal or the cervix. So version is the angle that the vagina makes with the cervix. What about flexion? Flexion is the angle that the cervix makes with the uterine body. So here is the endometrial cavity. This is the cervical canal. And you see this is the angle of flexion. So one is version and one is flexion. Now, anti means towards the bladder, because anterior structure is the bladder. Anti means towards the bladder. Retro means away from the bladder. So let's look at this uterus. This is the bladder, that is anterior. This is the direction of my probe in the vagina. So that is the angle of the vagina. This is the cervix. So as compared to the vagina, the cervix is moving towards the bladder. The cervix is directed towards the bladder. So this is an anteverted, and again, the uterine body is going further towards the bladder, so anti-flexed. So this is an anteverted, anti-flexed uterus. What about this uterus? Here again is the bladder. This is the direction of the vagina, and you can see the cervix is moving away from the bladder. So this is retroverted. What about the uterine body? The uterine body is also moving further away from the cervical canal. So this is retroflexed. So this is a retroverted, retroflexed uterus. Now, just like this, we can have the uterus, you can have any possible version and flexion, you can have various combinations. So let's look at this uterus on a this is a trans-abdominal scan. This is the uterus and this is the bladder. So this is the angle of the vagina. And what about the cervix? Is the cervix directed towards or away from the bladder? It's directed towards the bladder. So this is anteverted. What about the uterine body? The uterine body is directed away from the bladder. So this is retroflexed. So this is an anteverted retroflexed uterus. And therefore, you can have any combination: anteverted, antiflex, anteverted, retroflex, retroverted, retroflex, retroverted, antiflex. All combinations are possible. So now we've finished the first part of the talk, and that is the basic technique of ultrasound. But the second part, I think, is going to be the more interesting part, where we are going to discuss little technique tips by which we can fine-tune and get more information out from our ultrasound examination. So that we have a few minutes break, and just 2 to 3 minutes break, and we will come back with the probably more interesting part. Dr. Ladbans?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, you're there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Yeah, I'll just unshare my screen.